Welcome to the third session of this day-long event. This panel will address the, to my mind, crucial issues of U.S.-China cooperation on climate change and the environment. This is a great time to focus on this issue for three reasons. One, the UN FCCC series of global climate change reports has just...
The mic isn't on for you.
It's not working? It sounds like it's working here, no? Is this okay now? Okay. I'm not going to rewind the whole thing, but let me say this is a very important time to be focusing on U.S.-China cooperation on climate change and the environment. We have been warned now more categorically and with a greater sense of urgency about the dangers of climate change and the huge role that human beings and national policies have in the unfolding of this potentially globally disruptive process. Secondly, next year, in December of next year, the countries of the world will be asked to declare what their targets will be regarding emissions in the post-2020 period. So this coming year from now to then is one of those really critical times when this issue will be on the global agenda, and it will be on the global agenda to reach specific agreements on specific targets and modalities over the coming 12 months. And then thirdly, as I'm sure you all know, the United States and China are the world's two largest greenhouse gas emitters. China by far the largest now, the U.S. the largest if you look at cumulative historical emissions. But more than that, as you look around the world, everyone looks to see whether both the U.S. and China are going to be credibly addressing this issue in an ambitious fashion. And within each country, the politics become easier if both of us can move together, and become tougher if you're seeing as, you know, your leaders are pushing to take the lead on this, and the perception is the other country is not going to be equally ambitious and equally committed. So this is a great time to take up this topic. We have a terrific panel to do so. We'll do it in the following order. Qi will address the factors that affect emissions peak in China and how the Chinese put this issue together in terms of peak emissions. Jake Schmidt will provide insights from his working intensely with the Chinese on the issue of limits of future coal consumption in China, given that coal is highly polluting and is the major source of energy in China. Dan Wright will give a private sector experience view on dealing with the Chinese on developing renewable energy and clean energy projects. And finally, Kelly Sims Gallagher, who was able to join this panel only at the last moment due to well, she works in the White House, so you can imagine the schedule she is on now. We'll discuss what in a, say, realistic, but the optimistic side of realistic. In other words, what can you expect if things go reasonably well, going from here to the Paris meeting in December of 2015, how would you expect events to unfold, especially between the U.S. and China on the climate change emissions issue? Briefly, Qi is a senior fellow of Brookings and director of the Brookings China Center. He has long been on the faculty of Tsinghua University in the School of Public Policy and Management, and has had a career both on the analytical side and also in close advising and working with the government in developing their positions on climate change, both domestically and in international negotiations. Jake Schmidt is the director of the Natural Resources Defense Council's international program. Much of his career has been focused on climate change and related issues of sustainability. He has recently been participating in a project with the Chinese whose formal output will be available, I think, within a few weeks. Is that right? Yep. Within a few weeks. But we'll enjoy learning some of the insights from that on how the Chinese are now thinking about managing limits on coal consumption as they go forward. Dan Wright is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Thornton China Center. He is also the CEO of Greenpoint Group, which is a boutique strategic advisory firm that he founded 5 years ago to provide counsel to corporate and nonprofit decision makers on their China strategies. He also has a background of substantial interest, and his client base includes clients who are interested in cooperating on shale gas development and other kinds of cleaner, at least, energies via private sector cooperation. Dan also was in Treasury under Henry Paulson and was very much involved in the U.S.-China negotiations on the 10-year energy and environment cooperation framework and other related issues. And then Kelly Sims Gallagher is in the White House as Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. She is on leave from the Fletcher School at Tufts University, where she's Director of the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy. She's an Associate Professor of Energy and Environmental Policy and has done a great deal of academic work on the energy and environmental issues with a particular focus on China's policies and the implications of those policies for Chinese emissions. We'll start off with no more than 7 minutes of opening prepared remarks from each of our speakers. We'll just go down the line in this order. We'll then all moderate a brief discussion among us, and then I want to quickly turn to the audience because, frankly, I think the most interesting questions come from you, and we're anxious to be able to engage with you. So, Chia.
Well, thank you, Ken. Good morning, everyone. I have been traveling the last week away from Beijing. Normally, I'm pretty happy away from Beijing because of the smog, and this time it's quite different. My friends just keep sending these beautiful pictures of this clear sky now in Beijing, and I must say the Chinese government and the society in general has been very enthusiastically, tirelessly working toward this goal, have a clear sky during the APEC meeting. This includes the shutdown of the industries within Beijing and also with this 400 miles surrounding Beijing area, and of course 6 days of holiday people are enjoying right now. These actually has some interesting implications for policies. Since I told my friends I'm coming to this event, they sent me some policies. I summarized them right here. Number one is to make Beijing as a permanent site of APEC meeting. Number two is to extend the APEC meeting as long as possible. If none of this happens, just make sure that President Obama will stay longer in Beijing. But I want to get this very seriously. If we look at this, there are quite a few things we can learn. Number one is really the major cause for the environmental problem and the carbon emission is the fossil fuel burning. This is made very, when we shut down this many cars and factories and power plants, and all of a sudden you see a very different result. Number two is this problem, this very big environmental problem, and also carbon emission problem can be reversible. In the past we even lost hope, and now this can be reversible. Number three, and the international community can play a very important role for the domestic air quality in China. So my second point I want to lay out here is 5 years after Copenhagen. Now we're heading to Paris next year, and China has been very serious, about this meeting, and so are other parties. There are some major lessons we can learn from the Copenhagen process, especially when we put it in comparison to the Kyoto process. The Kyoto process has been largely a top-down approach, that the international community come up with an international global agreement, then to be implemented by nations and then by subnational unities and enterprises. Copenhagen was considered a failure. And it is considered a failure because before Copenhagen, everybody, especially the NGO communities, wanted a fair, ambitious, and legally binding the agreement. And of course, we did not get that. What we did get is something called the Copenhagen Accord, which is not legally binding and not ambitious, considered by many. However, when we look at the implementation, the performances of nations, under the commitment, these voluntary pledges of the nations, everybody actually doing a very nice job. Looking at China, Australia, the EU, India, Russia, all these major parties, according to the United Nations assessment, are well on track to deliver the results. And looking at the United States, it also has made some major cuts of the emissions. Take the power generation sector, for example, already by the end of the 2013, 17% cut already. So some major progress. This, we can learn from this. This is even though considered to be a unambitious and a non-legally binding agreement, can really produce some interesting results. So learning from this, and also looking at the situation in China, we just mentioned about this carbon emission peak, because the IPCC is saying the world emissions has to be peaked before 2020, and now we have seen the studies for the peaking time of China all the way from the 2025 to 2035, and there are, of course, a number of factors contributing to this, including this economic slowdown, which probably I can expand later in the discussion. But really, what we can learn from this, and especially putting it in this current context that President Obama is visiting China, we have a couple of points that I would like to make, as the kind of policy directions we can consider. Number one, it would be really great for this time or the next couple of months for China and the United States, particularly for President Obama and President Xi Jinping, get together to openly declare a world leadership on climate change. Together, align with this EU commitment. The EU just a week ago announced their commitment: 40% of emissions cut, legally binding, 27% renewables legally binding, and 27% cut energy improvement in energy efficiency. So if the two countries, U.S. and China, they can jointly declare, reach a political consensus on this, I think it would be really great. Number two recommendations is following your recommendation made 5-6 years ago, which is to make this collaboration on energy, climate change, and environment really a centerpiece in U.S.-China bilateral relationships, focusing particularly on this technological cooperation for clean energy, environment, and climate change. Number three is to review and assess the existing programs so far, especially those related to this clean energy research centers, the 10-year framework that Dan helped coordinated many years ago, and other programs. Then to extend that program and to expand in scope, and also to consider allocate more resources for promoting that. So let me just stop.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, and thanks, Ken, for putting together this great panel. It's an honor to be here. I enjoyed this morning. It's always good to sort of get some broader context of the Chinese landscape. So as Ken mentioned, I'll try to provide a bit of a snapshot of some of the work that NRDC has been doing, just to give you a tiny bit of context. We've been in China for over 2 decades and now have a staff of about 30 in Beijing that work primarily on environmental issues related to climate change and energy efficiency and sort of environmental rule of law. And one of the major things that we've done in the past year is launched an effort with 20 leading Chinese research institutions, government agencies, and scientific universities and so forth to look at a peak of coal consumption and to put in place a coal consumption target and to begin to analyze the sort of benefits of that. So this project includes researchers from Energy Research Institute, Tsinghua University, the Ministry of Environmental Protection, and so forth. And as Ken mentioned, we'll be launching a number of findings from that the week after Obama's there. It wasn't intentional. I guess we're the sort of cleanup crew, so maybe we can keep the air nice for you for one more week longer. And so I won't be able to provide you with all the details, but obviously the debate has shifted quite a bit in China. In my years of working in international climate, I think that one of the sort of main shifts that we've seen that's been a huge change in the direction has been this old debate about that countries like China are not doing enough to deal with this challenge. And that's a debate that sort of dominated American politics back in the Kyoto Protocol days, so about 2 decades ago now. And that debate has, I think, needs to shift, and it shifts because of reality. The reality is that China is doing a number of things to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions and is poised, I think, for even deeper action. You all know, and you've seen many of the statistics in terms of the deep deployment of clean energy that China has made. China has sort of broken effectively every record in terms of wind and solar deployment around the world. They've embarked on arguably one of the largest energy efficiency programs in the world. And so they've made a number of major strides. But obviously those have not been sort of enough, and I think that the growing public awareness around air pollution is a very striking fact in terms of the reality that the clean has been fantastic and it's helped to drive less of the polluting sources, but it hasn't been sufficient. And so the recent sort of air apocalypse and its front page news, as everybody knows, pretty regularly in China, it's gotten to the point that it's become the #1 sort of social unrest issue in many places and taking over for land reforms. It's become the sort of dominant theme in terms of a lot of the policy discussions. And so in response, you've seen the Chinese government, the state council, adopt a number of, I think, key signals, and I expect a number more will come forward. So in terms of addressing air pollution, the state council has adopted air pollution control plans for some of the biggest regions of the country, and those have included direct measures to deal with air pollution, but they've also directly covered coal consumption targets, because the reality in China is that about 50 to 60% of China's fine particulate matter, so PM 2.5, is contributed from coal. This is the sort of nasty air pollution that leads to premature deaths, leads to asthma, and leads to all the kinds of things that we've seen in the US and elsewhere that have been damaging. In fact, one of the findings from our work recently, we just released a report with researchers from Peking University and Tsinghua University that found that about 670,000 people in 2012 suffered from premature death from the air pollution caused by coal. And that doesn't include all the sort of subcomponents that are caused by asthma and lost days and so forth. So that's a striking number of people that are suffering from this air pollution, and it's a predominant debate, obviously, in China. In terms of going forward, I think what we see as a huge opportunity in China, and part of our work is identifying, is that solving the coal problem solves a number of other challenges that China's facing. Set aside the climate challenge that it helps to solve, which is a critical piece of the puzzle. It solves the air pollution challenge. As I mentioned, a number of people are dying. The air pollution in Beijing and elsewhere throughout the country is largely driven by overconsumption of coal. Second is dealing with coal consumption in a more direct way helps China deal with sort of its needed to shift to alternative sources of economic growth. So China is very unique in the sense that about half of its coal consumption comes from non-power sector sources. So that's iron and steel and cement and producers. That's a rare breed in most places in the world. So beginning to deal with the sort of overcapacity in a number of these sectors will also decrease the demand for coal and put reasonable targets on that front. The second piece is coal obviously has a number of other environmental impacts and water impacts, and so as China deals with coal, it will have positive impacts in terms of water scarcity, in terms of water pollution, in particular if it is coupled with solutions that don't just sort of shift the coal expansion to the west and build new plants there to deal with the air pollution that's happening in the eastern part of the country. And so it needs to have sort of a comprehensive coal consumption target to deal with that piece. The last piece is obviously the climate piece of the puzzle. China is predominantly, its emissions are predominantly from coal. It's not all from coal, but solving the coal problem and beginning to put a cap on coal consumption with a peak in 2020 will put it in place to have a CO2 consumption target or CO2 target of peaking in 2025 or before, which something like that is critical to what we need as we go into Paris and as we go into solving climate change. And so beginning to solve this coal consumption challenge is a key solution for air pollution, water, and public health, while at the same time is a key driver of China's efforts to deal with carbon pollution that as we go into this next round of climate negotiations that Ken mentioned will be a critical piece of the puzzle. So we are optimistic that the pieces are emerging in China, that just a couple of years ago when we started this effort, the debate was really around, okay, that's a nice theoretical idea that China will have its coal consumption peak and its CO2 peak, to a very live debate in the government around when will that peak occur, at what level will that peak occur, and how do we enforce it and implement it on the ground. And so what kinds of new tools does the government and so forth bring to bear in terms of developing that. And that's a critical shift as we go forward, and one that I think will show hopefully quite a bit of promise in the next coming months. So thank you.
Thank you. Dan?
Thanks. First, I want to thank Dr. Chung Lee and the Brookings team for a great day, and it's really a timely opportunity for us to come together before the summit next week. And I think all the panels are couched against U.S.-China cooperation in these different areas. Where I would like to kind of put the tag on my remarks is clean energy for crowded places. Because at the end of the day, that's kind of what it's about. I need to confess that I'm not a climate expert. I'm not even an energy expert. I named my little company Greenpoint after a town in Kansas called Greensburg. So that's where the green comes from. So please don't ask questions about climate. But I have had the privilege, both when I was at Treasury and now with an advisory firm, to work with some great energy and environmental companies on how to get from here to there. And Jake, a lot of what you're talking about is you do see a shift from the theoretical to really a buckled down focus on how do we move the needles in these different areas. What I'd like to speak to is a little bit more around the investment side, because at the end of the day, it will take investment, commercial activity, both from U.S. companies and frankly Chinese and global companies to be involved in this clean energy space. So I have 3 points with that. The first, if you're looking towards clean energy, you want to look for what are some of the fundamental constraints that if we could address could really kind of release more investment into that space. Secondly, I took note of Secretary Kerry's comment yesterday on energy policy So what's the solution there? And then thirdly, some practical thoughts around U.S.-China cooperation that can support us to get from here to there, as Bill said earlier today, going from the local kind of to the global, and obviously we need both directions. So as I was thinking through kind of the issue of what is the fundamental constraint issue around clean energy, I don't really see it as fundamentally a money issue or a technology issue. I really see, in my experience in China, it's fundamentally an issue around policy process, policy coordination, the wrong type of regulatory structures for the issues that will really release that type of investment and participation. I think there are three reasons for that. Back in political science in graduate school, and Ken Lieberthal's great book, Governing China, we learned about fragmented authoritarianism as a term to understand the Chinese political system. And the reason that came to my mind is, particularly in the policy process, the fragmented nature which we're seeing in the renewable and unconventional area, and the challenges around coordination. So that's one issue. Second, of course, the incumbent energy sources in China really grew up and were facilitated by a certain type of policy and regulatory structure which doesn't really work for clean energy. And we can talk about that more in the Q&A. Of course, the embedded interests that come up around that incumbent structure. And then finally, we all know, and this is, I think, what I'm speaking to is really emblematic of the larger reform implementation of third plenum reforms, policy coordination. There's a lot of churn in the Chinese government about who does what, how does one coordinate. So I think this is actually in some ways a case study to the broader challenges of reform implementation. Two very brief examples just to tag, and we can come back to if you would like. There's a ton, it's an amazing, as you said, Jake, the activity in wind and solar. But at the end of the day, if they're not connected to the grid and delivering energy into the grid, it's a lot of wind and sun with not as much delivery into the grid, which gets that clean energy to crowded places. So that's the coordination. That's an area, one practical area. And then another area, of course, shale gas has been such an important part of the U.S. story. And shale has potentially a huge potential in the China story. Where I'm seeing there is really a regulatory framework that's governing shale right now that was really developed for more traditional fossil fuel. It doesn't work. Just the nature of exploration around a very different energy source just doesn't work. And that really needs to be addressed to begin to attract investment into the shale space. Secondly, around the solution, I'll just quote Secretary yesterday. I was struck with how he brought it down from the global very specifically, and this is his quote: "The solution is energy policy. It's as simple as that. Make the right choices in your energy policy, you solve the problem of climate change." And I would add to policy process, policy coordination around that energy policy as fundamental. And then finally, the opportunity for U.S.-China cooperation in this area. The good news is there are some very solid mechanisms already in place: the Oil and Gas Industry Forum, the U.S.-China Renewable Energy Forum, U.S.-China Climate Change Working Group. So there's some very good dialogues and some very good conversation going on, including reverse trade missions. I think 2 weeks ago, the National Energy Administration was in California with Commerce, looking at how we're struggling with some of these same issues. But I would just encourage decision makers across the U.S. government to perhaps be a bit more intentional and more focused around this issue of policy process and coordination. I think if we could be more focused on that through these existing mechanisms, that could help us make progress, both to the policy as well as ultimately kind of the invitation or the channels where more investment and staying power would come from the commercial and private sector.
Terrific, thank you. I can't help saying it's a little bit of a mixed blessing to have a CEO, silver-haired, mature CEO of a company
Referring to your
say, "When I read your textbook in college." let's move on, shall we? Kelly?
I did too, Ken. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm so glad I was able to make it in the end. And thanks to Ken and to Cheng-Li for inviting me. And it's also a pleasure to be on this panel with the three of you, and in particular, my old friend and colleague, Chi Ye. I really have 4 points I want to make, and then if I have time in my 7 minutes, Ken, I'll answer your question, and otherwise you can come back. The first, which is very consistent with what we've already heard today, is that the United States and China are the two most consequential countries on climate change. They are the two largest emitters in the world, and together account for more than 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And I think they're also both very influential in the international negotiations. And as we look forward in the Paris process, these two countries have the potential to play a very important leadership role and give us a fighting chance to get a successful agreement in Paris. To your point about energy, they're also the largest energy consumers in the world. And so the energy policies and energy technology cooperation that the two countries pursue individually and together can be very consequential. I think it's fair to say they're the two largest investors in clean energy innovation as well. So my second point is that pragmatically, both countries have already begun to address climate change in a serious way through their domestic policies. I won't go into a lot of detail, but just to give you a flavor of this on both sides, the President Obama, announced his climate action plan in June 2013. And since then, the administration has announced a whole series of measures that are intended to get the United States on a path to make good on President Obama's commitment in Copenhagen to reduce U.S. emissions in the range of 17% below 2005 levels by 2020. And the Climate Action Plan has already released a number of specific policies, the Clean Power Plan that was already referenced, but a number of others, including an HFC program, a heavy-duty vehicle standard, very pragmatic, concrete, specific policies that are getting the United States on track to make good on that pledge. And just last month, we had another really nice development, I think, which was that the private sector stepped up and came and joined us in the White House for a roundtable on voluntary actions to reduce HFCs. And so together with their voluntary commitments and the administration's announcement to do a new rulemaking under the Significant New Alternatives Policy, the SNAP program, we're going to get some significant HFC reductions, which also makes good on a commitment the president made to Xi Jinping at their last summit in Sunnylands. But even though the United States has made a lot of progress domestically, I think we have to acknowledge China has as well. And the 12th five-year plan, I think, was a really significant shift from previous five-year plans in terms of energy policy commitments and, of course, China's first carbon intensity target. And that target, I think many people probably know, was a 40 to 45% reduction in carbon intensity below 2005 levels by 2020. And in September at the UN Climate Summit, Vice Premier Zhang Gaoli announced that China intends to reach the top of that range, which I think is also quite significant. So in other words, China will reach the 45% carbon intensity target by 2020, which puts them in a better position to have a more ambitious target for the post-2020 period. Jake already mentioned that China has very ambitious goals on renewables, solar and wind, also ambitious goals on nuclear. And it has established 42 carbon development zones in provinces and cities, and it's piloting 7 cap-and-trade programs at the city level. It's introduced coal caps in some regions. And I think all of these domestic policies create space, make international policy more possible than it has ever been before. So my third point is that leadership by these two countries has the potential to catalyze many other countries to make their own domestic commitments to reduce emissions, but also to engage in the international process leading up to Paris. The United States and China are already working well together. We have a robust program of cooperation through the Climate Change Working Group, which was launched by Secretary Kerry in April 2013. And that has an enhanced policy dialogue, but also very specific and pragmatic focus areas, including smart grids, forests, heavy-duty vehicles. It sounds almost, tedious. It's very, very focused. And the intention of the Climate Change Working Group is to get very pragmatic outcomes. Even though the United States and China are major emitters, they cannot solve the problem alone. So I think they have an important role to play in galvanizing other countries to be more ambitious domestically and international. In addition to that, the two countries' leadership on climate also provides a means for constructive cooperation within the bilateral relationship at a time when there are simultaneously a lot of challenges, and this is something we have to continue to bear in mind. Fourth, energy cooperation is already a major bright spot in the relationship between the two countries. I believe, and have done a lot of academic work myself, that as major economies, these two countries can work together on energy technology, research, development, and demonstration, and over time really drive down the cost curve of these technologies. And I think we already saw some evidence of that in the solar case, for example. And the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center has been a really successful model for collaboration between the two countries on energy technology cooperation. It's had a great run in its first 5 years, I think in part because of the unique and important IP model embedded in that center. And we hope that it will be extended and expanded over time, and we know that both countries think it's a model that can be pursued in other areas beyond energy, but also that we can grow this specific program on energy cooperation. I think one area we haven't done as much as we could is in the area of demonstration of technologies. The CERC has been mostly focused on the R&D side with some pilot scale demonstrations, but one area that we hope we can expand over time is commercial scale demonstration of technologies in both countries through cooperative programs, and in so doing, we can share costs for reducing, share the costs of demonstrations so that over time we can reduce the cost of the technologies themselves. So Ken, I just got an end, but I'm happy to come back on your question on the optimistic scenario for Paris.
We'll give you an opportunity to do that. Each of you has given a very interesting set of comments in a kind of macro perspective. Let me ask, since we have this meeting of our two presidents taking place next week, right after the APEC summit concludes. I think all of us who have talked with government officials who are preparing for this meeting and getting a sense of the agenda and that kind of thing, what I hear from every official is that climate change is going to be a serious part of this. I guess my question, let me ask for the first three of you, because Kelly, I know, is deeply involved in the specifics of this, and it's not fair to ask her to lose her security clearance and her job and return to Tufts early in order to answer a question on this panel. But for the first three of you, what would you expect to see come out of this summit in terms of climate change, whether it's going to be rhetoric or targets or commitments or just a broad kind of feel-good gloss. What do you think is likely? And let me just ask for a kind of quick bottom line response from Gia, from Jake, and from Dan.
In light of this release of the European target, I really hope to see that the both countries will have some clear indications as the what would be a target will be heading. I do not really expect the target is going to be numerical, but there's some kind of quantification would be really helpful. Kelly just mentioned this September 23rd meeting at UN headquarters. Vice Premier Zhang Gaoli indicated that China will peak the carbon emission as soon as possible, and the United States, with the new power plan, that 30% cut of emissions from the power sector, I think we're pretty well positioned in moving toward that target, that kind of indication of a target.
Okay, Jake?
I think two things, and to build on Chia's point, both countries, quite clearly can take deeper commitments as we go into this next round of climate negotiations. So having deep targets in 2025. I talked a lot about China. The Chinese, for the first time in recent history, have had a declining coal consumption target in the first 3 quarters of this year. I think that is a sign that a peak of coal and a peak of CO2 is possible and achievable, and so that's something that I would expect will at least be a part of the sort of nice conversation that the two leaders will have. On that front. And on the other side, I think the United States is actually poised for even deeper cuts, continuing what the president has outlined in the Climate Action Plan. So I think what Xi outlined is right. I don't expect that they will, unless Kelly sort of gives us two winks, that they will commit to particular targets in that time frame coming in the heels and in a lead-up to Paris. I expect that will come kind of early next year as these countries get closer to that early March deadline that a number of countries are supposed to come forward with their commitments. The second piece, and was sort of briefly alluded to, is there's a huge opportunity for the two leaders to advance the discussions on hydrofluorocarbons under the Montreal Protocol. They've made amazing progress. The opportunities are ripe for Chinese companies to leapfrog. The U.S. actually now has set in motion a set of the regulations that will begin that domestic phase down for the United States. We are now going into the next critical round in the Montreal Protocol, and historically, India has been the most difficult in that front, but on a recent state visit with Obama, Modi and Obama agreed to, I think, important progress on HFCs. So as we go into the next round of Montreal Protocol, I think there's a huge opportunity for the U.S. and China to continue to assert that they are going to phase this stuff down domestically and to engage in getting an agreement under Montreal Protocol, next year.
Yeah, I would pitch in not to underestimate the importance of leadership in the relationship, and that climate change being kind of front center at this summit really is very important. Set aside the substance of what you're talking about, which is also important, but as kind of a non-climate person, just the importance of these two leaders giving voice to this issue is really important because it opens up space. It encourages the appetite for these working groups we were talking about earlier between our two governments. Commercial partners become more enthusiastic about their own work, because at the end of the day, from my perspective, which is more of a bottom-up, it becomes very workmanlike. It's really about one decision, one negotiation, one trip, one exchange at a time. So leadership, really important. I would like to add that I understand that there are active negotiations going on to resolve the U.S.-China solar dispute. If that, under the right terms, could be brought across the line next week, that would be probably more symbolically important than kind of the really moving the needle on these issues. But that could be a great signal that our top negotiators really know how to solve and come up with mutually acceptable solutions to big problems. So hopefully we'll see that, but that would be something we should all be keeping our eye out for.
The major issue here, if not for public consumption next week, certainly as we go into next year, is the issue of making commitments for particular targets after 2020. I hear on both the U.S. and Chinese sides, a big issue is, well, what will the other side commit to? How early will it commit to it? And how credible is the commitment? And let me ask Kelly, since I gave you a pass on this first question, I'm going to put you on the spot on this one, which is, given that President Obama has made climate change a central issue, has really moved forward on this issue in practical terms in the United States, given that the Republican Party has made an equally central issue that climate change has no human component to it, and that any effort to address it is wrong-headed, simply saps, U.S. Jobs and reduces U.S. Competitive capability and so forth. And given last night, how does the U.S. under President Obama establish credibility for any targets that we stipulate, where those targets would have to be supported effectively by President Obama's successor and probably that successor's successor? In other words, how big an issue is credibility on this, and what would be the argument that we would make to really move the Chinese side forward and the two of us together move the world forward?
Well, that's a good, tough question. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I think that, let me answer that in two ways. I think the first one is that the United States has earned a lot of credibility in the last couple of years through the creation of the Climate Action Plan and these series of concrete steps that have been made. And as a result of those steps, we can clearly show that we're on a path towards achieving this target. And I know that the president is deeply committed to making good on his pledge from Copenhagen. And I think we already can see that that has earned the United States finally some room for, it gives the United States some leverage for asking other countries to join in making, progressive domestic policies, but also for engaging in the Paris Agreement. And I think, the administration intends to stay the course, to keep following through on the Climate Action Plan, and to see how much we can practically get done while we're still able to do that. And I think the steps that Europe took by announcing very early their targets for 2030 are also very helpful because we have, as I mentioned, pretty robust domestic policy measures in the United States and China, and now we have a very clear plan from Europe about what it intends to do over the next 10, 15 years. And so you put all of those together, and I know we don't have targets yet from the United States and China, but Zhang Gaoli stated very clearly that China intended to release its targets by early next year, and the United States does as well. So I think everybody wants to avoid another Copenhagen scenario. And if all three of these major countries, regions, can step forward with ambitious commitments by early next year, then I actually think that puts us in a very strong position for encouraging other countries, both industrialized countries and developing countries alike, to make their nationally determined contributions and announce them early so that we can start putting together a robust agreement in Paris.
Good. Thank you. Let me ask Jake, in your discussions about the future of coal in China, how much does the question of clean coal come into the equation? coal can't be burned without any emissions, even with the best possible technology. But there is an issue of carbon capture and sequestration, or carbon capture and use for enhanced oil recovery and that kind of thing. And my sense is there's a lot of debate about whether this really has a future of consequence or really does not. As you've been engaged with the Chinese on the future of coal, when coal will peak, what are the assumptions about emissions from coal? Since the peaking is very different from not using coal, it's going to be a major factor in the Chinese fuel base for a long time to come. Do you have any insights into what the thinking is about the cost effectiveness and technical feasibility and technical utility of carbon capture and sequestration or other approaches that are being discussed to produce quote-unquote clean coal?
Well, I don't have any secret, trade secret kind of ideas on this, but I think it is a part of the conversation in China. China has a number of carbon capture and storage pilot projects. They have a bilateral relationship with the U.S. In China, they like to call it CCUS, so it's carbon capture, storage, utilization and storage. I always forget. There's too many acronyms out there in the world. So it is a piece of the puzzle. I think the reality is that most of the conversations around coal consumption, peak and decline are around restructuring of the economy away, to more service-oriented industries. They saw this with the recent downturn in coal consumption. GDP still was increasing at reportedly pretty solid rates. There's a key piece for the energy efficiency part of the portfolio. China has embarked on a massive set of efforts on that front, but they have more to do in the sort of leading program that they have called the 10,000 Enterprises program, which focuses on the biggest 10,000 enterprises, as the name is, to deal with the energy efficiency there. They're amazing, robust targets that consistently get changed on clean energy, on renewables and wind, that if they do meet them, will make what has been done anywhere else in the world look like a pittance in terms of the clean energy deployment, because these are astronomically high rates of penetration of these pieces. So it's sort of and then there's a clear, I think, interest in sort of shifting towards more natural gas, and so that's why you've seen some interest in fracking in China and just expansion of natural gas opportunities. So it's a bit of all of these pieces are going to sort of move together, and looking at carbon capture and storage as a piece of the puzzle is clearly something that the Chinese deal with and are interested in. At least for us, part of the thing that makes us think that in China in particular this is something that needs to be pursued is that in the next 20, if China builds all the coal plants that it's going to build according to IEA that they've already built and that they're going to build between now and 2020, and those run for the sort of normal life that a coal plant typically does, that'll eat up about 40% of the carbon pollution that we have to stay on a 2 degrees Celsius world. So, they're obviously that they don't need to keep those plants, running for 40 to 50 years. But as we get into this next, kind of deep targets that they're going to have to take, many of these coal plants will be sort of middle-aged plants, and the sort of economics of shutting them down might make it more viable to have a carbon capture and storage, facility sort of attached to it to deal with the air pollution and the climate pollution at the same time.
Thank you. Why don't we open this up to audience questions? I think we'll collect 3 questions and then turn to the panel to respond. Feel free to direct your question to a particular panelist if you wish. And when you get the microphone, please first say who you are, what your affiliation is, and then what your question is. And why don't we start back there, Scott? I think.
And I've got a question for Chia whenever you think it's right to work it in.
All right.
Just
The third of the 3 questions in the first round will be asked by Dan of Chiet. Okay, so 2 questions from the audience first, though. Okay.
Hi, Scott Moore from Council on Foreign Relations. So implementation came up in a couple of your statements, and certainly the kind of how you measure, verify, report emissions is challenging for any large economy. But for China, obviously, there's sort of a particularly uneven track record in that regard. So the question, which I'd invite any of you to respond to, is China's MVR kind of capacity, is it robust enough to inspire confidence in emissions reduction targets in the context of an international negotiation? And if not, what needs to be done to make those targets or commitments credible? Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, here, and this lady, fourth row back on the center. Please come forward on the center aisle. Yeah, right up here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. This is.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I thought you were carrying the microphone. First, I would recognize it.
Quick question.
Please give it to her, and then I'll come back to you after this, okay? Sorry for the
Thank you.
confusion.
My name is Li Yang. About all these panelists, first, I appreciate your presentation. But with this and with economic development, I'm very much concerned while we want to progress in climate change or economic development, can we solve the social problem at the same time? And I always think about United States and capitalism, and currently we are having a financial crisis or homelessness that nobody really want to talk about it. They kind of conceal and suppress. They don't want people to talk about it. So I just wonder if Obama go to China, can we really press the social progress in terms of well-being for the general public rather than for a few people, wealthy and 1% versus 99%. What I try to say is we, in terms of climate change, we have technology and we have wind power, we have solar power. We can go from that direction. And a lot of wealth, 1%, if they want to invest, they have a lot of money. They don't need subsidies and they don't tax credit. Let's simplify the tax code and really make an effort to the progress of technology and the well-being of the general public.
Thank you.
I'll share my question with the other friend in the back. You had a question as well, real quick, and mine will be then very short.
Oh, thanks. This is Haijin from Garney Strategy. It's very good to see Dan and Kelly here. I have a question for them. I like Dan's quote very much. Is you make a good choice of energy policy, then you solve the problem of climate change. I think it's probably also true if when it's about the U.S. and China, you find you make a good choice of energy cooperation, then you solve the problem of climate change cooperation. So my question is, what do you think is a smart move for U.S. and China on new energy cooperation? Thank you.
And if I may, my quick question, I often ask Chia great questions in private. He's provided great counsel over the years, but here's more of a public question, and actually fits into this mix of questions. You advise and work closely with local government officials in China and their city strategies, and you observe these things. And how would you see bureaucratic behavior really at the city and really below the city? How do you see bureaucratic behavior changing in China, say, over the last 5 years on this mix of issues? Because that's really important, too, and it's kind of the other side of my question around policy process and coordination.
Do you want to take that up, and then we'll take up the question?
Sure. Well, the 2010, China made the first round of low carbon pilots, including 5 provinces and 8 cities. 2.5 years later, at the end of 2012, and China made another round, Kelly just mentioned. Altogether, right now, there are 42 of them, 42 low carbon pilots. These are the cities and provinces that are generally higher, with a higher per capita emissions, with a higher per unit for GDP emissions. And what we have seen in their planning and their target, they almost universally have a higher target, a greater target in reducing the carbon emission, in improving the energy intensity. I have also seen that over the last 5 years, particularly you just mentioned, and they are very much struggling on this issue of going on low carbon economy. On the one hand, you do not need to explain why you need to go low carbon, and they pretty much know that very well. But what they really need to do is the how question, how we can actually do this low carbon economy. Looking around the world, they want you to provide some good practices, and that worked in other countries and other cities, and they're really willing to copy that model. On the other hand, and they're very much struggling with this, going low carbon economy, and also there's a social issue the lady just mentioned, right? China is the country as a whole, and also the cities. They often caught in between this low growth and higher growth and lower growth. With the higher growth of the economy, you face a tremendous pressure, natural resources in the environment. And with the lower growth, you also face a series of social issues. And you just mentioned that cutting this the carbon emission from the power sector in the five years between 2006 and 2010, and China cut 73 gigawatt of the power generation capacity, smaller ones. I mean, that is so much bigger than many of the countries, 20% higher than the entire generation capacity in the United Kingdom. That also caused some social problems. So I find them often in that kind of a dilemma they are facing. Let me just quickly address Scott's question about the credibility of data. As a matter of fact, my previous work, leading that Climate Policy Institute, what we do every year is to review that data. But I think more convincing evidence of about the credibility is the United Nations Environmental Program. Each year they produce a report on an analysis of the gap, basically the performance of the committed parties, and also what is really needed for further action. So they have come up every year with a gap analysis report. And as one conclusion is from that UNEP report, and they consider China among some other parties is well on track in delivering its own pledges, commitment. We also see from some of the testimony in the Congress. So basically, you see at the national level, at a higher level, you see the data actually comes at a much greater credibility as if you go to the lower level of a government. Go to a smaller city, and even lower, you probably have a greater margin of uncertainty. Right?
Let me build on that, though, to ask one other question. You have 42 low-carbon pilot project areas, right? How do you, when you want to expand from 42 to cover the over 2,500 counties, how do you get the incentives right for that, given the enormous array of mandates that local leaders are now being confronted with under the reforms? Has that been something that's been thought through fairly effectively at this point, or is this really going to be something that we just have to watch very carefully and learn by experience over time on?
Well, as you can tell, Ken is the leading political scientist in the world. And I don't really think so. I don't really think that design was very much thought throughout. The 42 pilot program.
I was hiding my skepticism in a neutral question, but go ahead.
Right. I know. But I would not, as a pilot of that scale, that that's a great number, I would think it would be really, really hard to draw some conclusions that you can scale up at the national level. I would rather to see the smaller set of cities and provinces and then go for that. But this also reflects the level of enthusiasm as a subnational and local government. They really want to participate, and they have a motivations to participate. They even understand there was no or very little financial incentive for participating these pilots. Same thing can be said about the pilots for the carbon market. Right now, China is becoming the largest carbon market in the world, and people don't really realize that. In Guangdong province alone, which is one of the 7 pilot, already the trading volume is greater than the entire state of California under the AB 32. Everybody knows that one. So I think there were some serious design issues over there. How you design the pilot and how you draw the conclusions and then scale up for policy making at the higher level.
Good. Any other comments on?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take on the transparency MRV. Is China actually doing what it says that it's doing? Because it's obviously a critical question on many fronts. I think there's a couple of things. I mean, jokingly, there's probably at least, and Chia mentioned one, there's probably at least 10 different groups that will analyze whether or not China and the U.S. and others are actually meeting the kinds of targets that are out there, and in a sort of era where that information is pretty readily available, it's a much harder to hide your inaction than it was just 10 years ago when countries typically would make promises and never sort of follow through. But then I think there's a number of tools that haven't yet emerged, but that are clearly on the cusp, that haven't gotten a lot of attention in China, that I think provide at least some nuggets of where there might be sort of more tools, on the table. Because we found that what you need is to have, in the U.S. and elsewhere, that one of the critical pieces is to have, information on, whether or not people are doing what they say they're doing, and then 2, the tools on the ground to actually help enforce and implement those, in a meaningful way. And on both fronts, I think there's some recent reforms driven primarily through the air pollution lens, but that will have, I think, broad potential implications for China's climate policies. So first is, because of the air pollution, there is now readily available air pollution data throughout the country. You can get smartphone apps and track this stuff on a daily basis. The 15,000 largest facilities are now required to report annual air and water emissions onto the internet. Still not quite a perfect system, but it's moving in the direction of having that kind of information, publicly available, so that citizens and others can sort of, look at where the bad players are in driving that air pollution and kind of connect the dots to people. The second is that China reformed its environmental law and put in place a couple of pieces that we've found have been very, critical to, enforcement tools on the ground in the U.S. It used to be that you could sort of pollute into the water and get a daily fine and you'd be done for the rest of the year. But China reformed its law to allow for the local environmental officials to have daily fines, so that the tallies can rack up quite fast, and that obviously if you're a company, the last thing you want to do is have to pay a daily fine, so you hopefully quickly clean up your problem. The second piece of the reform, which is, we'll have to see how it plays out, is that China allowed 70 Chinese NGOs the right to bring lawsuits through the Chinese courts for companies that are failing to follow through on its law. Neither of these have been completely tested, but those are nice little sort of nuggets of hope. And then the last piece is, because the air pollution is so bad and has become such a dominant theme in China, the Chinese have put forward, or Beijing has put forward an air pollution reform law, and for the first time, and they've made that publicly available, the draft of it. So I think it's creating a bit more of a transparency in terms of law, and the law, if properly reformed, would have an additional set of tools to help local and central government officials sort of ensure that the air pollution targets are not just blown past. So there's a lot of nuggets. I think we'll have to see in the next couple of years how those sort of play out. But as my team in Beijing tends to point out, as I ask them why this is different, is I think the reality is that a growing middle class in China has sort of been told that they should become a middle class citizen, and now they're looking at the middle class lifestyle and going, I can't breathe the air, can't drink the water, can't eat the food. Is that a good deal? And air pollution, water pollution, food pollution, those are sort of unavoidable whether or not you're in the 1% or the 99%. You step out of your apartment in Beijing and the air is bad if you're a really wealthy person, and the air is really bad if you're a poor person. So I think that has shifted the debate quite a bit, and hopefully will lead to some of the sort of domestic or the implementation at the local and provincial levels, which we know has always been sort of one of the challenges in China, and it's a challenge in every country.
Great, thank you. 1, 2, 3 here. So start here.
Thank you. Kevin Massey with Statoil. Great presentation. Thanks very much for the insight. My question is to Qie and Jake, but I'd be interested in other views. The international climate negotiation discourse has been dominated in the last few rounds, certainly starting in Kyoto and through Copenhagen, by a kind of classification system, developing countries versus developed countries, and this taxonomy of Annex 1 versus non-Annex 1. Large part of what we've been hearing in the lead up to Paris is that this is less useful in respect to China's kind of position. What is the thinking in China when it comes to this distinction? Is there a view that the country is moving out of that category, and how do you think that will affect the negotiations in Paris? And one follow-up, if I may, on the negotiations, how does the Chinese view the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan? I mean, do they see it as sufficiently ambitious enough for them to bring something extra to the table beyond what they're already committing to?
Thank you.
My name is Xi Jinping from Japan, Nanyang University, and old friend of Professor Qie. We also cooperate with each other about climate change policy and energy policy, and consultant to the Chinese government. And he is the editor-in-chief of China Low Carbon Annual Book, something like that. I am chief editor of annual report of China's low carbon economy. So similar name, but we have no data and research. I have 2 questions. First question is about...
I want to ask for one question, only because we've only got 6 minutes left to wrap up the session. So if you could get to your question, and then we'll have one more, and then we'll have very brief answers.
Yes. My first question is about the so-called ETS, emission trading scheme system in China. So because I'm consulting to Hubei Carbon Exchange, I'm one of the designer of this kind of things, but it seems to that China will promote this kind of local carbon market to the nationwide in the next 3 years. And this is very powerful because now China shares about 60% of the carbon marketing now. So I'm wondering whether United States is willing to cooperate with China about this issue. This is the first question. The question goes to Caroline about that. Second question about...
Oh, I'm sorry. We have to move on to the next question because we really only have 5 minutes now left to wrap up the panel before you all get to lunch. And I don't want to stand between you and lunch. Yes.
Zhu Zhonghe from George Washington University. So I hope the panelists can talk more about the solar disputes. So the Europe and US they applied anti-dumping duties on Chinese solar panels, and they're claiming that Chinese government is subsidizing these companies, but China has denied the charges. So and this anti-dumping duty has driven up the renewable energy price, and which has not only affect the Chinese solar panel development, but also the the renewable energy industry in the U.S. So I want to ask, how optimistic are you about resolving this problem? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Given that we only have a few minutes left, let me just go down the line in reverse order from what we did with our original presentations and ask you to respond to what you want to respond to in terms of the questions raised and wrap-up comments.
If you don't mind, I'm going to draw on a couple of the older questions.
Oh,
To Scott's question, I just wanted to say that one of the very pragmatic steps in the climate change working group is to have a project on greenhouse gas data management. And I think that is a great example of the very pragmatic, let's learn from each other, let's solve problems together, and I think that's a promising approach. I also wanted to come back to the clean energy cooperation question, because one of the points I had wanted to make originally is that I think another promising way to move forward and to deepen and strengthen the energy technology cooperation is to do a much better job of bringing in the private sector. We have already had quite a lot of private sector participation in the CIRC, which was not really anticipated. It was hoped for, but not really anticipated. And there's been a significant matching of funds on both sides. But I think as we look forward, we should be looking at public-private partnerships on energy technology cooperation. I think that's good for firms in both countries, but it also helps to share the costs and reduce the public burden. And that's a really promising approach we should be pursuing.
Maybe just another comment on the solar dispute, which you raised. I'm not on the inside, so I really don't know how to handicap the chances that something will get done. But my sense is that there are kind of good forces, good kind of drivers, that there's a clock ticking in terms of how this case is set up, that fines will go into place here later in the year if nothing happens. So that, of course, the higher level focus around climate, I think, also creates a positive context to resolve something. But ultimately, it's down to the negotiators. And my sense is this is the kind of thing you spend up. You don't sleep for a couple nights while you're in Beijing to try to get something done. But so I'm hopeful, and it would be just both substantively important, but also symbolically very meaningful to say our two countries can get something done. And then it opens back up kind of the green revolution, as we say, which is going forward.
Just very quick, because I know your time on the division between developed and developing countries. I think the reality is that you're unlikely to get an agreement that such a division has evolved, but the reality has already shifted in terms of what countries come forward. So while at the same time I think that there will be differentiation between what countries do, the kinds of targets that China is putting on the table. I mean, we're talking about a peak of a growth target and a peak, and in the U.S. we're talking about a decline below kind of historic levels. So just the nature of the targets that countries will put on the table will be very different, and I think that that's true because China is different than the U.S. and the U.S. is different than China, and China is different than India. I think on the emissions trading system, there's we'll have to see kind of how this evolves, but there's I think clearly a growing awareness in the policy level within China that the sort of command and control system that they've worked very well in the past to drive some of these, shut down some of these plants, that there's a limit to that as they kind of go to the second and third generation of environmental controls. And so things like emissions trading, things like stronger fines, and kind of more market-based mechanisms are clearly something that the government's interested in. So we'll have to kind of see how those evolve, but they have committed to some big efforts on those fronts.
Thank you.
Yeah, real quickly, in the reverse order, that solar panel trade dispute, I think it's a very interesting case, very important case indeed to for this dilemma, how you balance the accommodating this trade isolationism, right, and addressing the climate change. What is interesting, though, from that case, the development is, with the U.S. and European barriers put it over there, and China was able to develop a much larger domestic market for that, which turned out to be not so bad, actually. In the past, 95% of the solar panels were going exported. Now, the big share of that going inside China, which is really good thing, I think. For the ETS question, I think it's really good. The problem is, so far, we have not really seen a very convincing model that's really working. EU ETS, right? I just came back from Europe. People have very, very different views on that. So I'm not very certain about the future, the prospect of the Chinese ETS. Then for that question on including developed country developing country or developed country, under the Durban platform and looking toward Paris, I mean, this becoming less of an issue. And although I would assume from the Chinese perspective, you also to stress the continuation of this common but differentiated responsibility. But this system nominally is still there, but less and less we see the real content of that principle in there. And the Chinese view on the new power plan, and I can't speak for the Chinese government for that, but it's a very, very interesting proposal, and have different views here in the United States. I think one way to compare is how you compare that to the European program, and looking, because that probably puts it on a more of a comparability level of that. If I look at that 30%, you compare cut of that's basically make you go back to close to the 1990 level for the power sector. So, but I want to emphasize, though, I think that the Chinese climate change policy is primarily driven by the domestic factors rather than domestic economic factors, the political and social factors, rather than by the international pressure. As President Xi Jinping made it very clear in his meeting with John Kerry on February 14th. And he said, we want to do this, not because others want us to do, but because we really need to do this. Finally, one second, I want to echo what Dan said earlier, which is I see what is lacking. I think that this UNFCCC process is primarily driven at the technical level. Rather, I think what is really important is to build a political consensus at a higher level, and also I see the importance of this the leadership, national leadership, international leadership. That's really, really important. That's why I would feel very excited for instance like the September 23rd UN meeting and this meeting, APEC. APEC meeting, the leaders represent 60% of all emissions, and the UN summit, only 40% of emissions was represented by these leaders, by the presence of the leaders. So every time we have chances like this, it's a really great opportunity we should seize.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a very rich discussion, packing a lot into a short period of time. I'm sorry to have been the